Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Cambridge University Center for Geopolitics Indo-Pacific Roundtable 2025. This is our fifth and largest iteration of the roundtable, which continues to grow. It's now, as I said last year already, was the largest conference in Europe of its kind, and we hope to continue expanding beyond this to all kinds of new areas and fields and perspectives. So thank you again for coming, and we look forward to a great conference. And so I'll launch right in then to what I was going to say in more general terms by way of a so-called keynote. And really what strikes me is the question of what is geopolitics? What is the Indo-Pacific? Why are these concepts useful? And what can we do with them? Right? So if we think about geopolitics, we can go all the way back to some very early sources to think about where this comes from and what it means. I mean, literally, it means politics of the earth, right? Or land-driven politics. And we can go back in China to the Sun Tzu Bingfa, or the Art of War, as it's often translated, chapters 9 and 10. Chapter 9 is called Di Xing. Chapter 10 is called Jiu Di, right? So we have the shape of the land and the 9 different types of land as 2 chapters in this primer, basically, on how to wage war. We can find similar references to geography, to the particular history and politics of given states in classical antiquity in Europe and the Mediterranean world as well. If we look at the histories, for example, of the Persian Wars, the Peloponnesian Wars, the Punic Wars, and so on, right? There's a strong concern with where states are located, what kind of politics exists inside those states, and what kind of powers those states are trying to be on the international stage in order to then analyze the way they relate to one another, and particularly the ways in which they wage war with one another. Now, later on, much later on, ideas around what we now actually termed geopolitics became fashionable in parts of Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century, right? We can find this kind of thinking behind instances such as the so-called Great Game in Central Asia at the turn of the 20th century, as well, or late 19th, very early 20th, and as well as in other areas of sort of the age of imperialism and in the run-up, indeed, to the First World War. So much so is the term associated with this time and place that when I first started working at the center about 4 years ago, I went to a conference in the United States and I gave somebody my new business card that said Center for Geopolitics, and he kind of looked at it and said, "Geopolitics, eh?" And he sort of fished in his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper and says, "I've got a telegram from the Kaiser. He wants his IR back." Right? So, there's this sense of, an antiquated notion among many, or at least a time-delimited one, in which the thinking of key figures was driven by this sensibility around geopolitics, but in an era that is very much passé, right? Or at least was seen to be that way. That said, the development of such thinking and theories continued to develop, or continued on through the 20th century, in corners of international relations, corners of history, corners of comparative politics. But it still leaves us today with this open question of how do we define the term? And why do we use it? And speaking purely for myself, not in any official capacity for anyone, I would define it the following way. I think it's really the study of international relations from a perspective richly enhanced, but also bounded and in some ways limited by the particularities of place, time, people, and ideas. That is, it's a type of IR scholarship that is rooted deeply in area studies, history, and systematic knowledge and analysis of politics inside individual countries, and inside individual countries on all sides of an interaction. Now, if you have country A, country B, and country C interacting in some way on the international arena, to analyze that from this perspective, you would really have to know in some detail the history, the internal politics, and sort of, for lack of a better term, the area studies background on all three of those countries in order to look at them in interaction with one another. So that's, if we say, what is geopolitics? That's what I think it is. And we could argue about whether that's the best definition or not. We could tweak it, we could fine-tune it, but I think at root, that is why it's valuable, is because it gives us those things, and I'll explain why that utility is there in some more specific areas in a minute. What about this term Indo-Pacific? Right, when I first heard this term, I didn't like it, to be honest. A lot of people don't like it. A lot of people in China specifically don't like it. A lot of people in other places also are uncomfortable with it, in particular because of its genesis and early history. But I would maintain that it is useful for a couple of reasons that I'll get to in a second. So in contemporary parlance, meaning over the last 15 years, 20 years maybe, where it really has sprung up was in some of the rhetoric of Abe Shinzo when he was Prime Minister of Japan, talking about this as sort of an analog to other concepts that he also liked, such as this kind of arc of freedom and prosperity or something like this, or of democracy and prosperity. I don't remember exactly what the term was, that would stretch sort of from Japan in a crescent down through Southeast Asia and over into the Indian Ocean. Now, that's also precisely why some people in the region and beyond don't like the term, because for them it has echoes of other concepts in Japanese history of what that arc might look like, right? Or what a co-prosperity sphere might look like. And so it harkens back for many to this sense of Japanese imperialism. But I think that's a rather narrow way of looking at it. So why is it actually useful? Why do we still use it here for this roundtable and for a lot of other things? And is it really still useful? Why don't we use instead just simply the term Asia or Asia-Pacific? And the reasons for this, in my view, are twofold. If we just talk about Asia, we're really talking about the majority of the world, right? We're talking about everything technically from what we would normally think of as being part of the Middle East to Japan or even beyond, but we're probably excluding the Pacific Islands while including large parts of Central Asia and Western Asia that we're not necessarily talking about in this context, right? So if we say Asia-Pacific, on the other hand, that conceptualization frequently, in the minds of many at least, and indeed in things like grant programs and the division of bureaucracies, often excludes South Asia, right? Often when we think of that, we're really thinking about sort of China, Japan, Korea in Northeast Asia, and then all of the various states of Southeast Asia and the ASEAN grouping besides, but that's it. Maybe the Pacific Islands as well, right? But that's pretty much it. The advantage of Indo-Pacific, as I see it, is that it allows us to include, forces us to include actually, not just India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, etc., but also at least the eastern part of what we could call the Indian Ocean world. Right? We're not necessarily thinking about the east coast of Africa or Madagascar, but we are thinking about all of the politics around the Bay of Bengal, right? And indeed about South Asia as much as we can, although we've done less of that practically in the center than I would like or than we aspire to, and more on East and Southeast Asia. But we are certainly thinking about that. At the same time, the emphasis on the oceans rather than the continent, right, saying Indo-Pacific instead of Asia, allows us not to think as much about Central Asia or Western Asia. Right? Not that we shouldn't think about those places at all, but that it is difficult to conceive of them coherently as being within the same conceptual space as indeed that arc from Japan through Southeast Asia into the Indian Ocean and the parts of continental Asia that border it. Right? So in other words, we have Japan, the Koreas, all of Southeast Asia, all of the eastern part of the Indian Ocean world, and China. Right? That's essentially what we're thinking about when we think about Indo-Pacific. And I think, therefore, because that boundary is more clearly drawn with this concept rather than others, it is still worthwhile to keep it, despite the baggage that it has in the minds of some. So then, if we're talking about geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific specifically, why is this approach distinct, and what can it give us as opposed to other approaches? And then how can we look at some current issues through that perspective? Well, the approach is distinct, I would say, in a couple of ways. Some might say, well, this looks a lot like what some people call in international relations neoclassical realism. Right? And they'll point to analyses largely of US foreign policy, sometimes of some European states' foreign policy, and where the scholars are interested in defining political coalitions that get behind particular kinds of policy preferences and drive states in particular ways. And I would say, yes, I welcome that analogy, except what we're really interested in is not just the political coalitions of the moment and not just the political coalitions inside one state. Right? If we look at the classic works of neoclassical realism, lots of classics there, what they tend to do is examine a particular state. Right? So it's the United States, or it's Germany, or it's Japan, or it's a series of states that are deemed to be analogous in different settings to try to figure out what were the coalitions that drove them to construct empires or to start great wars. That's very valuable, and it's very much in line with what I'm thinking, but it misses two steps. It misses the step of looking at that not just in the context of that one-off interaction, but in the entire arc of history and politics inside that state. And it misses the step of looking at that interaction inside one state with pairing it with the similar interactions in another state with which that first state is interacting. Lots of interactions there, as well as lots of classics. So what we really then are doing, in a way that I think neoclassical realism and others don't take the leap to do, is to blend at the roots comparative politics, history, area studies, and the analysis of international relations. And I think that is actually quite distinct and novel in the context of debates around international relations and foreign policy. We're also very careful in this perspective about the limits of generalizability. Because of such attention to contingency and specifics, we know how far we can and cannot generalize with confidence. And so we can say, for example, that we've got a great explanation of the way in which the Korean War began. But we don't necessarily have a great explanation for why the so-called Second Indochina War or the Vietnam War began, based on that. It's a different context. It's a different moment. They're different players, right? So we can't necessarily generalize from one case to another. We know that. We know in what ways the generalization is bounded. We can be much more careful about that. So the trade-off is, versus other kinds of IR perspectives, that geopolitics of this kind is less nomothetic or parsimonious, but more accurate, empirically grounded, specific, and deeply rooted. So why is it actually better than others? It allows for more specificity, more contingency, more attention to these things. It's richly contextualized such that many assumptions can be relaxed. If we think about a lot of general theories, built into them really are lots of assumptions. This perspective allows us to relax most of those assumptions and start inductively from a deep knowledge of the particular cases, players, ideas, and time periods. It avoids simplistic overgeneralization or recourse to blunt principles in favor of a much more subtle, nuanced, and careful approach that may lead in some cases to more equivocal or contingent or specific narrow findings, but actually findings in which we can have much more confidence. And so very quickly then, in the last few minutes, I think it might be useful to look a little bit across a few different current issues in the region from this perspective and see what we can get from it that we might lose from others. Think in general first of China's international relations, China's position on the world stage. There's lots of talk around this in many different quarters of society, politics, and academia today, inside China, outside China, all over the world. What I think a lot of that talk is missing is actually this degree of specificity rooted in the case. If we think of the perspectives that are now popular, what they tend to do is make blunt assumptions. They make assumptions either, on the one hand, that, and I've heard this actually recently several times very forcefully made, I think in part because of the influence of the work of certain scholars, notably Yan Xuetong, right, that China has never colonized anyone, right? China has no history of threatening its neighbors. And, therefore, due to the long history of Confucian ethics in Chinese politics, China is no threat to anyone else in the world system. That's actually even a sort of cartoonish characterization of Yan Xuetong's work. But there are people espousing this idea quite widely in many circles. There are also people who seem to assume that China is bent on complete revision of the international order as it now exists, and that it will be forever the rising power versus the status quo powers that are there, and that due to this kind of tragedy in great power politics, there is a structural imperative that says China will always challenge the dominance of the United States, its allies, and others, and always seek to subvert, undermine, or destroy the international system as it finds it. Again, a somewhat cartoonish characterization of John Mearsheimer and others, but one that is widely held, I think, by many in a lot of spaces. Both of these, needless to say, are wrong. If we look more carefully, what we see is that Chinese politics inside the state is not monolithic. It's not all driven by one person's whim. There are different constituencies, coalitions, and actors in contestation with one another. And there are indeed debates about what kind of foreign policy China should adopt. And of course, China does wish to expand its sphere of influence. It does threaten certain neighbors at certain times quite significantly, right? You could just ask even the people in what is now Yunnan province about whether the Ming Dynasty threatened them. They're part of China now and have been for several hundred years because of that threat, right? So this idea that China never attacks its neighbors is obviously wrong. But at the same time, China has no interest in completely subverting, destroying, or undermining the international order. China ceased in many ways to be that sort of a breaker, as one might call it, in the classic sort of Krasner trichotomy in the 1970s. And why did it cease to have that position? Because it didn't think it could win. It still doesn't think it could win doing things that way. So how can China win? By playing within the rules, within the system, using the system to its own advantage, and eventually, slowly, reshaping some of the rules in its own image or interest. And we're seeing this now quite powerfully, as in fact we were talking about last night, as the United States has retreated from a lot of norms and rule-making institutions and behaviors, leaving an open space that China's been very eager to fill. Right? So if we look at that aspect of Chinese foreign policy, it's fairly obvious where it's coming from and where it's bounded and what it's actually looking to do. If we look at China's relations with certain other states, for example, why is China's relationship with India so changeable in the last few years? Right? From some perspectives, this would be very hard to explain. But if we look at it from this perspective that I've just outlined, I think it's actually rather easy to explain. Since 1962, or even a bit before, China perceived the Soviet Union and then Russia as a major international threat, if not the primary international threat, and India as being linked far too closely to Russia, or the Soviet Union before that. And so the imperative always was to either to try to break that link between India and the Soviet Union or Russia, or to undermine India's position as a security actor. Now, with Russia very much isolated on the world stage and in a weakening position, in fact, the danger is not that India will be too close to Russia, but that India would go too far away from Russia and side too much with the West. Because if China's actually interested in balancing other great powers, right, it cannot afford to have India on the same side as Japan and the United States aligned essentially against China, with only Russia to balance everybody and Russia in a weakening position, right? And so in order to prevent too much of an erosion of that link, in a very stark reversal actually of what had been the Chinese policy aim for decades, now China is trying to improve relations with India, right? But again, this should not be a surprise if we take account of these other considerations that lie just there. Similarly, if we think, and I know I'm just about out of time, so I'll go very quickly through a couple of things. Actually, just one. I'll just mention Taiwan and the Taiwan issue generally. There's a lot of debate inside Taiwan and about Taiwan regarding the degree of likelihood that there could be a war in the Taiwan Strait or an attack on Taiwan from the mainland. And there are some who say, no, it will never happen, and others who say it's imminent. And there's a lot of sort of froth and excitement around both sides of this issue. In fact, if we pull back just a bit and think about this through a lens of history and the politics on each side of the strait, both in Beijing and in Taipei, what we see is that there has been a fairly stable equilibrium on the ground since 1958 in terms of the exact security situation, since the second Taiwan Straits crisis in 1958. But what we also see is that the two sides are engaged in a complex, iterative, and evolving signaling dynamic. Right? What they're doing is trying to send one another clear and costly signals of intent and of essentially threat and response to threat. And this dynamic is very, very well understood on both sides of the strait, I would argue. And what we see is both sides trying to evolve in their strategies and in their tactics in this dynamic in such a way that they can gain a bit of an advantage. So there is change, right? There are things like saying, well, we'll do more of these military exercises rather than missile tests, or respond in this way or that way with sort of asymmetric responses rather than something else. But fundamentally, the dynamic is still there. And so while there is some risk always of conflict, a significant risk always of conflict there, the fact that both sides understand each other as well as they do, that both sides can read and understand the signals that the other is sending as well as they can, I would argue reduces substantially the imminent risk of actual military conflict breaking out. Much, much lower risk than I think a lot of people in many circles would claim, and in fact the much higher risk in the region of conflict is not there, but in the South China Sea. And we'll be talking about that a lot on a couple of panels, but essentially if we look at the South China Sea situation, we have a much larger number of players who understand one another much less well, and a much larger number of sort of overlapping claims and interests in a dynamic that has changed much more radically over time. Right? It has not been a stable equilibrium since 1958 at all. Things have shifted radically in the South China Sea at several points and continue to be very much uncertain. So given that, given indeed the less sort of well worked out politics about the South China Sea policy in many of the player states, right? It's much harder to get to that kind of stable signaling dynamic, if indeed that were even the goal of any of the players, which is less obvious there than it is in the Taiwan Strait. So I think that's just a small bit. There are other areas that I could talk about that I was going to, but I'm pretty much out of time. My hope is really just to underscore that using this perspective of geopolitics, defined again as analysis of international relations that really is deeply rooted in area studies, history, and the analysis of individual countries' domestic politics. In other words, informed by the particularities of place, time, people, and ideas, applying that to this region that we call the Indo-Pacific in a bounded and careful way, can produce arguments and conclusions about this most dynamic and important part of the world that are in some ways at least more robust, if sometimes less seductive, than those produced by other theories I would characterize as more simplistic. Thank you very much. Now we'll take a quick break before the first panel.